Report shows the Biden administration has flown hundreds of thousands of migrants from foreign countries directly into the U.S. on flights using an app. In fact, the Center for Immigration Studies found last year, from January 2023 to December 2023, at least 320,000 illegal immigrants were allowed to fly into the U.S. from their home countries through a controversial program of the Biden administration using the Customs and Border Patrol app, the CBP-1 app that was created to let migrants apply for parole into the U.S. The Center for Immigration Studies sued to get information through the Freedom of Information Act and finally released it yesterday. The report states, quote, "The program at the center of the Freedom of Information Act litigation is perhaps the most enigmatic and least known of the Biden administration's uses of the CBP-1 cell phone scheduling app, even though it is responsible for almost invisibly importing by air 320,000 aliens with no legal right to enter the United States since it got underway in late 2022. Under these legally dubious parole programs, aliens who cannot legally enter the country use the CBP-1 app to apply for travel authorization and temporary humanitarian release from those airports. The parole program allows for 2-year periods of legal status during which adults are eligible for work authorization. Joining us now to discuss is former Acting Commissioner of Customs and Border Protection and Fellow at the Heritage Foundation, Mark Morgan. Good morning to you. Now, this report is stunning. Hundreds of thousands of illegal immigrants flown into 43 different airports, again, from January through December 2023. And Mark, to be clear, migrants have been flown to their final destination after arriving here in the U.S., especially at the border. These unaccompanied children, that's not a secret. And you said we've known about the CBP-1 app. However, Americans might be surprised to learn one of the uses of this new CBP-1 app was to fly migrants into the U.S. on commercial passenger flights. So we're talking about over Mexico, over the border. What's your reaction to this?
Yeah, look, I'm glad CIS once again, great reporting to confirm a lot of what we have already known, Jan, like you said. It's really unconscionable, but this is the shell game we've been talking about. This is what they've done, this administration. They've made a deal with migrants from all over the world that said, hey, if you refrain from illegally entered along our southern border in between the ports of entry, what we'll do is we'll let you fill out a couple of lines of paperwork online, and we'll actually let you fly in to 43 different airports in the United States where we'll process and release you this way. So it's absolutely to cover up bad political optics. It's try to reduce that optics from those illegally entering. And this is an absolutely abuse of their authority and parole. And keep in mind, this is why we've seen from 2020 to 2023, the average was about 240,000 come to our ports of entry in 2020. In 23, that was 1.1 million, Jan, coming to our airports. That's a 370% increase.
But are these migrants, they aren't coming to a point of entry. They're actually coming from their home countries, right?
Correct. They're coming from their home countries. They're able to get on a plane after filling out a couple of the lines on the CBP-1 app, fly themselves to a port of entry, an airport, basically anywhere in the United States. Right now, what this report said is they're flying into 43 airports. Right. That's information that we didn't have before.
We did not have that information before. And what I found interesting about this report is that the administration would not reveal also where these 320,000 migrants came from, nor would they disclose which U.S. airports they were flown to. In fact, in the lawsuit, it actually states this, that the locations were not disclosed due to fear bad actors would inflict harm on public safety or the information would create law enforcement vulnerabilities. What do you make of that? Why would we have a program that is so shrouded in secrecy with such concern of grave consequences?
Yeah, look, there's a lot that are coming up here. Now, we did know some of the countries, Cuba, Nicaragua, Venezuela, and Haiti. We knew those were the 4 countries. But what this report identified through the FOIA request is they're actually using the CBP-1 app for countries well beyond that. And again, the 43 airports was something new. Part of the secrecy is because this is a shell game. They know they're unlawfully using parole. They're trying to hide that from the American people. They know that they're flying them into 43 different airports. They're trying to hide that from the American people as well. And as far as the vulnerabilities, that's the same thing at the southwest border in between the ports of entry, Jan. When we're invaded by millions of illegal aliens, that pulls resources away from law enforcement, national security mission to process these illegal aliens. That's the same thing happening at the airports. Those precious CBP officers are pulled away from their law enforcement national security mission to process illegal aliens. So there's a whole list of reasons why they're trying to hide this from the American people.
I'm so glad we're showing video right now of airport security, because it can take an hour just for a few hundred Americans to go through TSA security. So when you consider 320,000 migrants who were flown into the U.S. in just a year, how were our airports able to handle the influx? What was the process?
Yeah, so keep in mind, this is another reason why they were able to keep this secret, because you're talking about flights from outside of the country. So this is CBP owns that. TSA doesn't own that. And that's exactly how they were able to keep this from the American people when flights coming in from the United States. It's CBP that does all that initial processing. But again, just like for Border Patrol agents in between the ports of entry, when you flooded and you've increased that flow by 320,000, it's taken those officers off the front line, away from their normal national security and law enforcement mission to process these illegal aliens. And Jan, another question I have is, what kind of documentation are they requiring of these illegal aliens? That's something else that we don't know.
This is very important, because you mentioned Venezuela. You mentioned countries that we don't really have diplomacy with. How can we even account for who some of these migrants are? Because according to this report, the CBP One Parole program allows migrants who have not been approved for asylum to apply for what's called travel authorization and temporary humanitarian release from these U.S. airports, meaning they can stay in the U.S. for a couple of years without obtaining legal status. But how do we know who anyone is that's entering this country without adjudication?
Okay, look, that's another great question, and we don't know that information. Just like they've hid so many other aspects of this program, we don't know. I don't know what type of documentation they're requiring, but you bring up a very good point that we talk about when they illegally enter in between the ports of entry. We don't have diplomatic relationships with these countries. So in my experience, there's no way that we're actually learning anything about these individuals' criminal background before we're letting them board a plane and come in. Another thing, do they have passports? Do they have any other form of documentation? Or are they able to get on this app, fill it out, print it off, and now that's their piece of paper and documentation they can fly with? There's still a lot of unanswered questions, and that is also part of the vulnerabilities.
Always great talking to you, and there's so many questions about this report again. A lot of this information that just came out last night. Former Acting Commissioner of Customs and Border Protection and fellow at the Heritage Foundation, Mark Morgan. Great seeing you as always, sir. Hope you have a great week.